Welcome, everyone, to the Kepler webinar, Generations the Sequel. Last month we had the first part of this webinar, and Patricia had so much wonderful information that she wasn't able to get through it all. And everyone who was there kept emailing going, oh, please, please finish off the signs. So that is what we're doing today. We have Patricia Walsh back again. And for those of you who are not familiar or don't remember from our last webinar with her, she is a deep memory process practitioner, and she leads and co-teaches trainings in spirit work as well as regression. She is a graduate of the Jeffrey Wolf Green School of Evolutionary Astrology, and her focus is on healing. So today, like I said, we are picking up from the webinar we had previously, and I hope you thoroughly enjoy yourselves as much as we did last month. So thank you so much, Patricia. It was wonderful that you agreed to come back to do this. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I'm a Pluto Virgo, so I felt guilty. Well, you didn't deliver what I promised.
You had an amazing collection of information, so this is really a gift. Thank you so much.
Welcome, everybody. This is just welcome again, I should say. Mercury's retrograde, so we might as well do it again. This is just a reminder of my website for those of you that might want to visit and see where I am in the world, and also a couple of the books that I have out there. And also there are lectures and things available on my site. I just wanted to mention that. So, picking up from where we were, I do want to recap a little bit of what I covered. This is a handout that you should have received. It's useful to have this printed out and as we're going on, so that you can see the years that I'm talking about and the generations and how they cross over to the Pluto generation. So this column here is showing the actual years that Pluto was in a particular sign, and underneath here is where I have where some of the demographic studies or demographers have defined generations. As I mentioned before, they do cross over, but the next slide is going to show you some interesting things that have evolved in the way that demographic studies are defining generations. I do want to point out one thing here that I noticed in my handout where I defined the Pluto Scorpios. There were some demographic studies that at one point were trying to define this generation because they found, well, anyway, I'll get into that in a minute, but they were defining them in these years as 89 to 2000, which would include this generation, and calling them the possible pluralists. But it's been clarified actually more since then that the pluralists are actually the 1995 to 2010 generation, which is the Pluto Sag. So Pluto Sag is squarely within pluralists, and the Pluto Libra and the Pluto Scorpio is actually where things get confusing from the demographic studies, in that they're mixing them Gen Y millennials. I talked about the orbit of Pluto a little bit. I just want to reiterate again that the generations I'm going to talk about today are this, where Pluto's elliptical orbit comes to perihelion to the Sun and very close to the Earth, in other words, and kind of bends and goes much quicker through these signs. So the signs that I'm going to be talking about, picking up with Pluto Libra into Scorpio, Sag, and Capricorn, is where Pluto speeds through these signs. So there are some, you know, there's interesting implications about that, but also in general sense, we can say that these generations, and especially the ones at the apex of this, which is the end of Pluto Libra and Pluto Scorpio, specifically the Pluto Scorpio generation, are experience just psychologically within themselves experience an intensification of evolutionary pressure. And I had mentioned before that a lot of people joke that Pluto only spends 11 years in Scorpio because humanity wouldn't survive otherwise. So yeah, this was the point that I made before. This is the chart that is just kind of show a little bit of a cross of how the generations are defined and what's happened in demographic studies. So as you can see here, this would be the Pluto Cancer to Pluto Leo generation, and look at the time span here that demographers, this is not Pluto's transit, but it echoes Pluto's transit. And in fact, what's interesting about this chart is this is a classic case of where life imitates astrology. Haha, you know what I mean. in that astrology really has a basis, and it shows up here where we're defining generations by a basic bottom line psychology, which is defined by Pluto in a sign. And yes, of course, there's sub-generations there, like I said, you know, the Pluto-Uranus generation. I'm not getting into those distinctions. I'm going more into the broad distinctions. But demographic studies have picked this up. So they actually have started to, in recent years, start to redefine the generations by a lesser time span. And this is exactly what Pluto in signs is doing. Where they are confused in the demographic studies is in between the Pluto Libra to the Pluto Scorpio generation. They're trying, well, they call them the Gen Y, they call them the millennials, and they mix these two generations together, yet, and I had mentioned this in my other talk, that what's interesting is when you read the demographic studies side by side, they think they're trying to describe one generation, and they actually describe such a broad dichotomy where on one hand they'll say, oh, they're complete team players, and on the other hand they'll say they're, you know, absolute hate authority and won't listen to anybody. Clearly, from our perspective, knowing the underlying psychology, that's a difference between Pluto Libra and Pluto Scorpio. But where it's starting to now get distinct, as far as if you were to go online or buy books or buy any of the white papers or look at the white paper descriptions of these generations, here you're going to see it. The Gen Z, right here is where the Pluto-Sag generation is clearly defined as the pluralist generation, because the demographic studies have changed that now to include almost the exact years that Pluto was in Sag. The same thing is happening for the Pluto and Capricorn generation, which is now called Generation Alpha, that they will, they don't have the ending years yet, but if they stay with the 12 to 15, this generation will almost also be clearly defined by Pluto and Capricorn, so their characteristics will be described very clearly. Another point I made is that in generational, looking at how each generation builds on the previous generation, that the sextile implies that there's a certain kind of affinity, and this is something I mentioned that we see, you know, in generational things. Sometimes this is parenting, like this Pluto Cancer generation is raising a Pluto Scorpio, although that, I'm sorry, Pluto Virgo, although that's not always the case because this was a larger generation. So sextile in generation implies a psychological affinity, and you'll see that and maybe remember some of what I was talking about in the previous generations. The square, interestingly, as I've looked at what each generation has done, what each generation initiated, and when things start to come to fruition, I started to notice that the square, just like we understand the first quarter square, which implies that there's some kind of crisis or a tension between the past and the future, the opening first quarter square archetypally often represents a kind of youthful impetus, that there's, you know, something new that needs to be expressed. And this is what we see an example for looking at Pluto Cancer generation to Pluto Libra generation, which is where I'm going to recap a little bit about these three generations and then launch into a further, deeper discussion of these generations. But many of the things initiated by the Pluto Cancer generation come to a kind of fruition in the Pluto Libra generation. So now, just a slight recap. This is Pluto Cancer, and the theme that I gave just briefly about this generation had to do with, this was a generation that gave up everything for their family and their country. They fought the major world wars. They're called the greatest generation. They had a lot to do, just as we know with the Cancer archetype, had a lot to do with family and ancestry and our kind of, our ancestral inheritance. One thing that I want to bring up about them, or re-bring up about them, was in evolutionary astrology, we notice, working with individuals, that anything karmically on the Cancer-Capricorn axis generally shows that there's some kind of gender switch going on. So as I was saying, in evolutionary astrology, we look at this as that there's some gender switching going on. And this happened a lot with the Pluto Cancer generation. What I had said is that because I'll bring it up in the Pluto Capricorn generation, but most of this generation, or a large part of this generation, had to work with redefining gender roles. And that happened because of the wars. The men were forced to go off to war and the women were forced into the factories. So they were kind of, forced into what up until that point had been traditional male roles. So there was some gender role assignment changing going on. From the evolutionary perspective, I would say that more in this generation, when we say gender switching in evolutionary astrology, we generally are saying that, we know that souls change genders, but sometimes life to life to life, for many lifetimes, we've all been both. But sometimes a soul will go on a kind of little run where it'll have several lifetimes in one particular gender. Say it's incarnated for 10 lifetimes as a female, and there'll be one pivotal life where it will start to switch genders. And that's what we talk about in gender switching, and that's highlighted in the Cancer-Capricorn axis, which I also equate a lot to the anima animus, which is the inner masculine and inner feminine. But in this particular generation, the Pluto Cancer generation, my speculation is that more of them were in their currently switching genders to prepare for their next life as the other, to flip to the other, I'm trying to get this out, to flip to the other gender. So for example, I believe that many of the people in the Pluto Cancer generation in their current lives, if they were male or female, that was what they had an affinity to, but as a generation, they were now starting to explore what does it mean to be the other gender, so that in their future incarnations, they would be flipping gender. Okay, that's Pluto Cancer. Pluto Leo, I talked about that they actually changed so much from the Pluto Cancer generation, in that where Pluto Cancer was all about, country and responsibility and sacrificing everything for the whole, the Pluto Cancer, Leo generation came out of the gate really yang, very much about outer expression and very much about personal power and creativity, and they experienced and initiated, as they were coming of age and coming into power, a lot of social change, but a lot of the underlying theme for them had a lot to do with, if it feels good, do it. These were all the key phrases from the Woodstock generation, the flower power. It was about sexual liberation. So they really changed the roles from the Pluto Cancer generation and started, if you think of the Leo Aquarius axis, because the axes are also part of the experience of that generation. So both signs have some influence on the bottom line psychology. If you think of that, there was a lot of liberation in that generation, which would be having to do with the Aquarius polarity. So they were, trying to liberate from gender roles, liberating from societal roles, liberating from sexual roles that were very prevalent in the previous generations. I did talk about, counseling that generation in that they really have a lot of concerns and issues about bringing their gifts and talents out into the world, issues of personal power, issues of creativity, issues of creative self-actualization, etc. Some of them have, it goes on both sides. Like I've seen a lot with the Pluto-Leo generation that I really would consider them seed people in many ways. Many people in that generation seeded new ways of thinking and new ways of being that the next generations are really getting the benefit from because of what they so radically changed. Again, thinking of the movement from Cancer to Leo. Cancer is a cardinal archetype which initiated something, and then Leo kind of gets the benefit from that and runs with it. Okay. Pluto Virgo. So I'm one of them. So I could totally. I'm actually a double signature because I'm a Pluto Virgo in the 6th house, although I am the Pluto Uranus conjunction generation or subgeneration. The Virgo archetype is a preparatory archetype, as all the mutable archetypes are. They're shifting something, but Virgo itself, lying just below the horizon, if we think of the natural wheel of the zodiac, Virgo is transferring all of the energy from the lower half of the zodiac to the upper half, where another cardinal change happens, which is in the Pluto Libra generation. So Virgo, is a yin sign. It's internalized. I call that the inner side of Mercury as opposed to the yang outer side of Mercury that rules Gemini. So as a yin sign, this is a kind of drawing in. So the Pluto Virgo generation is much less pronounced than the Pluto Leo generation. In fact, some people say, what happened to them? Where'd they go? They're not as loud and brash as the Pluto Leo generation, but what I see with this generation is they've done a lot of work quietly behind the scenes. They've had their own reforms. A lot of the alternative medicine movement we can give to the Pluto Virgos, that body-mind connection thing, which is very much a body-mind-spirit, which is very much about the Virgo-Pisces axis. But part of what some of the core themes that they bring in are those preparatory themes, and emergence has been a big issue for this generation, both individually and collectively. The thing that we do have going on though now is that more of the Pluto Virgos are coming into power now. And as I had mentioned, Obama is one of the first Pluto Virgos in our country that's taken power. So now we start to see this generation coming into power. And part of that also, has to do a little bit with Pluto is now trining. Transiting Pluto in Capricorn is trining back to the Pluto Virgo generation. So progressively more of the Pluto Virgos, and I see this in my own counseling practice, although some might say that's a little bit of late blooming, I see the 40s, 50s, 60s, 40, 50-year-olds right now saying, I'm going to come into my power, and they come in with counseling issues having a lot to do with emergence. As I said, this is it's an inward-looking archetype, so there can be a feeling of, after the Pluto Leos were, it was all about creative self-expression, the energy pulls in, and then this is more of an archetype of self-improvement. So self-improvement itself as an underlying psychological complex can actually trip somebody up because they're always trying to self-improve and they're never good enough, and that's a real bottom line for the Pluto Virgo mentality. They just never feel good enough, and that's often what stops that emergence or them coming out. But as I said, they have been kind of quietly working behind the scenes. As I said before, I feel that the Pluto-Virgo generation is in place to clean up the excesses of the Pluto-Leo generation. And I think in some ways we can see some of that going on with the financial crisis, which of course affects every generation on the planet right now. But we can see that many of the CEOs and rock stars of the economy, rock stars of corporations, were all Pluto Leos. So we can see the Pluto Virgos now having to come in and figure out how to clean up that mess. Moving on to Pluto Libra. So I did start with Pluto Libra in the last lecture, but I'm going to launch deeper into this generation now because we didn't have enough time. So Pluto Libra's coming of age in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And starting to, come into power also into the 2000s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. So we're definitely seeing more of their influence in society now. As a general theme for this generation, I would say that this is a generation of extremity and a generation of great expectations. To me, that's two very key words for this archetype. We tend to think of Libra as being inherently balanced because it is the sign of the scales, but when you think of actual scales, the balance is very easily thrown off. Like a slight feather will change the balance. So in truth, the archetype of Libra is not inherently balanced. It's an archetype that knows extremity but seeks balance in spite of extremity. So what we find, how this relates to the personal psychology in somebody, and I see this in my own practice, counseling practice, as well as my regression practice, with the Pluto Libra generation, many of them walk in my door already fully aware of the inherent extremity within themselves. I've actually had Pluto Libra clients say to me, I'm completely aware of my peacemaker and my murderer. So they're aware of this broad spectrum of what exists within them, which is quite extreme. But the desire of the Pluto Libra generation is one of balance. So what we end up having there sometimes is that, well, how do I explain this? An operative mode sometimes, that a defense that happens within this generation is what I call the defense of denial. And the reason why that arises is because the desire for balance is greater than looking at, for some, I'm not saying all, but for some, the desire for balance is greater than looking at what the reality is. So they'll escape into the way things could be, the fantasy of something, the ideal of something, and, kind of do the, that's nice, and, plug their ears and do the la 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 la, while things are blowing up around them. That's a classic. I've seen this classically with this generation, that denial is one of their operating functions. And actually in some of the demographic studies that I'm going to talk about in a minute, they've also identified that in this generation, that there's a little bit of a bubble mentality sometimes. Now, one thing I do want to jump back to, because I didn't talk about it before, is that within each generation there's obviously different levels of evolution. So the archetypes play out different. So we have to keep that in mind, that we're looking at, consensus state reality, individuated state reality, and spiritual state reality within each generation. And I'm not going to go into that much, but if those of you that are interested, if you look into evolutionary astrology, you'll see that that's something that we intrinsically understand, that there are different evolutionary states on the planet, and how each of these evolutionary states plays out an archetype is vastly different. So there isn't a kind of general one-size-fits-all. So another issue of the Pluto Libra generation, specifically again that I see generationally with them and individually, is they come in again, think Pluto and think Venus. So just think of those two planetary archetypes and how they combine. And classically in evolutionary astrology, we would say if somebody has Pluto-Venus contacts or Venus in Scorpio or something like that, that their way of relating is that they are here to reform the way they relate, which means that they very frequently are calling in or are surrounded by past old lovers. So it's like the re-meeting. Like, for example, if you have a Pluto transit your natal Venus, you'll find all of a sudden old lovers will emerge. Well, we understand this karmically also, meaning that many people in this generation have known each other before, not that that's unique to this generation, but have known each other before as intimate lovers. And so they're re-meeting each other and playing out a lot of old karmic dynamics. And one of the largest karmic dynamics that this generation is grappling with is the issue between codependence and interdependence. And that's something that this is the bulk of my Pluto Libra counseling and regression work are about relationship dynamics. They all come in demanding this, or they generally are finding that this is the biggest thorn in their side, let's say. So they're trying to figure out the dynamics of how, they very much desire to be in harmony and in relationship with others, yet they're finding themselves confronted with the intricacies of codependence. An interesting point I'd like to make is that the word codependence itself was coined in the 1970s when this generation was being born, and it was coined by the outgrowths of the AA movement, the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, which then actually has now a chapter, or I don't know what you call them, a subgroup or whatever, of those who are in codependent relationships, and they use the AA 12 steps on working on that. That's something that was completely unknown to generate. I mean, think of a Pluto Cancer sitting around talking about codependence. I mean, I find it interesting, but very relevant to this generation. And, pop psychology, it has made it that, has brought it to the forefront. This generation conditioned by, and as you remember from what I was showing you before, or if you look at the Pluto years, everything that is conditioning this generation also conditions the following generations, although at slightly different ages. But because Pluto's transits through these signs are so fast, a lot of the social things affect all three generations, Libra, Scorpio, Sag, quite equally. So we had, we had September 11th in defining this generation as they were coming of age. There were the Rodney King riots. I thought were an interesting defining thing for this generation, in that the phrase that came out of that was, "Can't we all just get along?" Which I think is something that's a very deep desire for this generation. I believe I said last time that archetypally, again, this isn't exact for everybody in that generation, but archetypally, this generation has a resonance with ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So I think they have very deep memories of those kinds of, especially Greece, societies that were built on beauty and democracy, and that's some of the ideals that they really want to bring into manifestation. The difficulty is that bringing it into reality. At least in my observation, I don't know about you, but in my observation, humanity doesn't manifest ideals very well. So that becomes, like I said, part of that dichotomy of wanting the ideal so bad and then being faced with the reality of how to actually make that happen. So Gen Y, as they're known, and as I said, that they cross, Gen X crosses into Pluto Libra, but if you read the demographic studies, Gen Y is where the demographers get the most difficulty trying to define the difference between Pluto Libra, Pluto Scorpio, because they are trying to smush them all into Gen Y i.e. millennials. And as I said, when they'll describe them, there's one study that I read that describes them as narcissistic yet team players. I find that a funny dichotomy. Again, could exist within one person, but, they may also be looking at two different generations there. Gen Y's gotten a really bad rap in demographic studies. They describe them, there's one study that keeps getting touted that was, I think it was the cover of Time or something, and it said, if you think the boomers were self-absorbed, wait until you meet their kids. So they clearly, what's interesting though is to notice that sextile from Leo to Libra does come out in this generation. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute more, that in fact this generation is called the echo boomers. So even the demographers have picked up that there's an echo from the Leo generation to this generation. They are described as, so now breaking out the Gen Y parts that do apply to Libra, they are described as team players, that in the workplace they really desire to have team approaches to things, that they need a lot of positive feedback. So some of the old managerial styles, that this is one generation, the first generation actually, that's challenged the way that management is done in the workplace, and they've been identified as the generation that's changing the workplace, specifically because their psychology is so different from the previous generations. The way that you manage the way that you manage Pluto Virgo by guilt doesn't work with the Pluto Libras. They do say that this generation intrinsically has a deeper sense of self-worth than the previous generations before. I find that interesting, considering the Libra archetype, the Venus archetype is often associated with how not only we relate to others, but as ruler of Taurus, how we relate to ourselves and issues of our own personal worth. They have called this generation the me generation, which echoes back to Pluto Leo. So here's where they start to pick up some of the Pluto Leo stuff, where they're related to as the echo boomers. This generation, some of them raised by the Pluto Leo, some of that's their parent generation. As I said, Pluto Leo had an archetype, a generational mentality that, do it, live your passion, be all that you can be. So this generation comes out of that, psychology, feeling that why would you want to do anything but what your passion tells you to do. They're carrying this idea into the workplace, or as they're starting to come into power. And again, the unfortunate thing though is that they're born into a time when they're meeting economic hardship, as we know, since the financial collapse. So some demographers have looked at this and said that this generation has had to scale back their expectations, that they were misinformed by the previous generations, that following your passion as career advice is not something that necessarily they can expect to manifest. And this is where I think some of this generation is having difficulty, because they do intrinsically believe that they want that, yet they need to manifest it. Now, where that has come out positively with this generation is as opposed to any prior generation, this is the first generation where we started to see an increase in entrepreneurship. So at a younger age, and that is specific to technology. So technology, because when we were a manufacturing industry, and that's something I failed to mention about Pluto Virgo, the Pluto Virgo generation was the generation that saw the transition, and again I'm speaking specifically U.S., move from manufacturing to service industry. And service which is a Virgo keyword, is kind of interesting, led to technology. So yes, technology involves hardware, but technology also has a lot of virtuality to it, which now enter Pluto Libra. Right, and when you look up here on my slide and you see all of the, the social media and so on and so forth, that's largely attributed to this generation bringing that in. Well, there's a lot of young entrepreneurs behind that. And, just like the Pluto Leos grew up dreaming of having a garage band and being a rock star, this generation and the Pluto Scorpio generation specifically, they have more of an ability to create a business in their garage and be successful at it than any other generation prior, specifically if they're working in technology, creating, people have created apps and become billionaires or millionaires. I think I talked about that before, that Zuckerberg is one of those. He's one on the cusp here where he's a 0-degree Scorpio, Pluto Scorpio retrograde. So he's literally in between this Libra-Scorpio generation. And when you look at, my joke about that is making money off your friends, right? So how to make lots of money off your friends, and their friends, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we do see technology largely influencing this generation and their opportunities in the workplace, although being challenged economically. The entrepreneurial side of that is actually quite increased for this generation. They also largely, right now, as we're speaking, the Pluto Libra generation and Pluto Scorpio generation are largely Silicon Valley. So that is those two generations. So what we see coming out in advances in technology and out of Silicon Valley right now largely is the psychology of those generations. But interestingly, there was a recent study in the New Yorker that was talking about Silicon Valley as a psychology, and I saw a lot of Pluto Libra reflected in there, where they were saying that it's kind of like a fantasy world. Silicon Valley lives in its own little bubble, and around it are all of these, desperately poor immigrant workers and so on and so forth. And they said, the Google bus kind of picks up people and, goes through all of these really decrepit neighborhoods and brings them to this idyllic campus where you can get everything you want and anything you dream of is available in Silicon Valley. These corporations, have built their own little Disneylands on their own campuses. And that, that sounds a lot to me like Pluto Libra, that kind of really wanting the ideal, yet it could exist in a bubble. They do believe some of their idealism is projected onto technology, and that's what this New Yorker study was saying, that they actually believe that they can solve the world's problems by getting everybody on Facebook, which, they feel that if you have this open platform of communication in Congress, which to a certain degree can lead to and has led to increased multi-racialism and socialization. Yet at the same time, it's not quite practically grounded, I mean, as far as making social change, actual social change. There was somebody, this New Yorker article pointed out that on the Silicon Valley campus, Barack Obama visited, and somebody asked one of the colleagues if they were going to see the president, and the colleague said, I'm making more of a difference, doing my technology thing than anybody in government could possibly make. Well, again, there may be some truth to that, but then there may also be the danger that there's a little bit of a bubble there. Further, this generation, I want to point out that this is when indigo children arose. Now remember, this is an air generation, right? So yes, it's Venus ruled, but it's airy Venus. So a lot of this does have to do with the commerce, the exchange of thoughts and ideas, and as we know, like I said, the social media and all of that. But this is also when, you know, indigo generation or indigo children first started to come up, it was clearly from this generation onwards. A few demographic studies further that this is some of the reforms that they've brought into the workplace, which did not exist for the Pluto Leos or the Pluto Virgos. Work-life balance is actually a buzzword in the workplace right now, largely brought in by the Pluto Libras. So again, it's interesting that that word balance is there and that many of them are seeking, whereas identity for the Pluto Virgos and even some of the Pluto Leos largely had to do with what they were doing in their career. Pluto Libras diverging from that. Their pleasure and their lifestyle, again, that echoes back to Pluto Leo. What they do for pleasure is equally important to them as what they do for work. So this idea of work-life balance is reforming the workplace in not only that in order to keep these employees, which is a big thing for major corporations, is always looking on how they're going to recruit generations. In order to keep these employees, they've needed to change, you know, things such as unlimited vacation time, you know, giving people me time. They actually call it that in the corporation. They take, you know, 2 hours to have me time. So it's kind of interesting that they're starting to change that. Another thing that I want to mention about this generation is that they are one of the first most liberated generations, and that's where we see the fruition from Pluto Cancer. So Pluto Cancer picked up very quickly from Pluto Aries, which started, as I was talking about when I talked about Pluto Cancer before, started with the early abolitionist movements. The rights of women played into, so that started, wait a minute, I need to back up. Pluto Aries, the early abolitionist movements that were about alcohol actually had an undercurrent of abuse of women and children, and so many women got on that bandwagon. That started to come to fruition around the Pluto Cancer generations and the early suffragette movements that led up to that. So some of those ideas of equality in gender and equality in social role is starting to come to fruition in the Pluto Libra generation. Many people say that this generation is the first, and again I'm speaking specifically U.S. or even Western culture, is the first truly liberated generation. So, getting into just a little bit about counseling this generation, as I said, having them unravel and helping them unravel the difference between codependence versus independence. That's a bottom line for this generation. Helping them also to understand that their desire for equality needs to balance with reality. So there's some, you know, how to make those things manifest is something that's important to bring to this generation. Another thing that I find with them is that many of them, again, like I said, that extremity part is also to help them to realize that there is a broad spectrum of their inner experience that they're bringing in. Like I said, those kinds of extremes. Part of how that plays out in a negative sense is that there can be splitting within this generation, meaning internal psychological splits are heightened because trying to bring together a peacemaker and a murderer within one's own psyche is a very difficult thing to do. So there'll be a denial and a repression of certain parts of oneself. Helping them to understand their internal dichotomies, and that they don't have to compartmentalize them as much as needing to marry them, which is a very Libra term, as we all know. So intermarriage might also be another way we want to look at this for all of the disparate psychological parts and sub-personalities that an individual within this generation may be aware of within themselves. It's helping them to find the intermarriage of all of those disparate parts. Another part of this generation quickly is because of the societal expectations, they they can split from what their authentic selves are in lieu of what they think they need to be, should be. Needs and expectations are a big thing for this generation. So on one side, they can be more aware of what they need or expect, or they can repress it for social acceptance. And that's a big core thing with this generation, that I find them struggling within themselves about how to get their own needs met and also be socially accepted within their peer group, et cetera, et cetera. So are they being true to themselves or not being true to themselves? Because they do have a tendency to value themselves much more by what other people expect from them. And that's a karmic condition that they've come in with. Any questions before I move on about this generation?
There is a comment about the work-life balance where someone is mentioning the fact that the Cancer generation during the Depression and the growth of unions was certainly the first incarnation of a work-life balance, because that's why we actually have weekends.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, there were two radical movements that happened from the Pluto Cancer generation, and that was the birth of unions, which started to bring leisure time and vacation pay. You know, so they started that, and again, fruition here in Pluto Libra takes it to another level.
Another question on you contrasted codependence with interdependence, but then said a statement of codependence with interdependence. So they're just trying to figure out and clarify what you meant by that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I do. I look at them as offshoots of each other, but when I speak of codependence, I'm speaking more of the difficulties of relating, and often confined within the word codependence. No, I think that the ideal state that Pluto Libra is looking for is how to interdependence, and you see that a lot here, and it picks up in the Pluto Scorpio generation, where there's more, where they're thinking about use of resources, and they're thinking about how do we share more, how do we cooperate more. You know, bartering is one of the first things that started to come out of this generation. Local currencies is something coming out of this generation, as well as virtual currency coming out of this generation. And this can be a platform for a new social kind of economy, or a new global economy, which, if I jump ahead, I'm going to predict that by the time the Pluto and Capricorn generation comes of age, that will be the fruition of this Pluto Libra generation, that they will be picking up virtual. There'll be a global economy. I think currencies won't even exist by then, and I think it'll all be virtual. So what I mean is that I think that what they're seeking is interdependence, but they get stuck in codependence, and that's what they're working out.
You did mention Zuckerman as being born right on the cusp in the Pluto cycle. When you are working with someone like that, do you use the signs on both sides, or do you have...
Yes, up to 3 degrees. Sometimes even up to 5 degrees.
Okay.
They bring in qualities of both generations and karmic issues from both of those archetypes.
Well, that seems to be all the questions right now.
Okay, great. All right, so let's move on to Pluto Scorpio. I actually think I'm going to get all the information I brought with me out on time. I think I'm getting better at this webinar thing.
I just wanted to quickly, somebody's mentioning here that they have an astrology teacher using a donation-based model.
There you go. Yeah. This is a, an interesting development from this generation, that I said we're going to see more of each generation picking that up and implementing it. And as I said, the Pluto Libras are on the cusp now, some of them, but they're on the cusp of coming into power. So they've come of age, they're a large part of the workforce now, and many of them, and this is one thing that demographic studies have also pointed out for this particular generation, Pluto Libra, many of them are in managerial positions much younger than previous generations ever were. And this is part of some of the discrepancy within workplaces. Like they say that, 50, 60-year-olds are taking orders from 20-year-olds, which, is quite disturbing to them, right? 20 or 30-year-olds. But again, it's that kind of equality mentality of the Pluto Libra generation. They do describe them in the workplace as being that kind of generation that they don't care if they're 30. They actually believe their opinion and they should be listened to and taken as seriously as somebody who's 20 years older than them. So Pluto Scorpio. Now again, like I said, the generations squish more here. Some of the things that Pluto Libra was conditioned by are quite strong with the Pluto Scorpio generation as well. Pluto Scorpio. I have called this generation, in my own estimation, what I've seen a lot with the Pluto Scorpio, and this also relates to Pluto in any sign in the 8th house. They have a bottom line mentality. I call them, they've come in with an Armageddon consciousness. Many of them in past lives and as a soul group have been in some of the worst places within humanity, some of the darkest places within humanity. This generation, again, like I said, you know, the end of the world as we know it that started at September 11th and onward, this generation experienced that in their high school years as they were just starting to form their social consciousness. And when you think of what that means, you know, in your high school years, September 11th, and then ever since then, it's been one war after another. It's the war on terrorism, it's Iran, it's Afghanistan, Iraq, da-da-da-da-da-da. And pretty much that's all this generation has known thus far. So they're highly conditioned that reality is pretty tenuous for them. You know, we describe Pluto and Scorpio in evolutionary astrology as a kind of consciousness that's come in waiting for the other shoe to drop. They're expecting the rug to be pulled out from under them. And this generation, when they were starting to be born, and when they were starting to come of age, this is what they brought to us. And look at what's happened since that. So I always say we can thank the Pluto Scorpio generation for bringing us Armageddon. Now, has it literally played out? We don't quite know yet, but this generation is a very pivotal generation in bringing that kind of consciousness to us. They have a very bottom line mentality. This is a no bull generation. They don't want any baloney. Give it to me straight. On the other side of that, though, and maybe I'll get into that in a minute. I'll save that for later. I want you to think of the glyph of Scorpio, and here I'll draw it with my cursor. The highest, you know, we have the M like this, and then the upward pointing tail at the end, right? That's the Scorpio glyph, if you think. And that, to me, describes a lot of the psychology also. Carrying on from Libra's extremity into Scorpio, they have the same thing. They have been to the extremes of the highest of the high and the lowest of the low, which is what the Scorpio archetype is about. So if you think of that M that then goes down and then goes up and then goes down and results in the final upward pointing tail, what it's showing is that for evolution to occur, one must go to the highest of the high, to the lowest of the low, to the highest of the high, to the lowest of the low, for final resurrection to happen. That is what the upward pointing tail at the end of the Scorpio glyph means. So this is a group, a soul group that has come in with this intrinsic knowing, and they have experienced it firsthand. You know, it's a kind of hardened mentality, as well as what I've noticed with them is a little bit of there's a soul weariness with them. So as I said, end of the world as I know it, as we know it, again, Iran, Afghanistan, the average age of soldiers there are the Pluto Libra Scorps, but the interesting thing is the average age of those killed or severely wounded is clearly in the Pluto Scorpio. It's 20, which is clearly in the Pluto Scorpio generation. This is another thing I mentioned about people that have been to extremes, Pluto Scorpio specifically, people that have seen, again, the worst of humanity and the best of humanity. They come in with, and I wrote about this in my book, they come in with the volume turned up to 1,000. This is the effect of trauma on the soul. This is the effect of that kind of extremity on the soul. So with that, they push the limits. People that have that kind of volume turned up to 1,000 sometimes need reality to be louder than it is for somebody who is not doesn't have the volume turned up to 1,000. This generation, you know, we see that playing out in this. There are a lot of, you know, pushing the limits, and it has to be really extreme and really severe because there's a level of their psyches that's just inured to not getting it if it's too subtle. So sometimes what I see in this generation is a very black and white mentality. Again, carrying on from some of the extremity that Libra has is squarely in the psychology of this generation, that intrinsic. It's now as this generation has come of age, and as they now are, you know, entering closely behind the Pluto Libra, not quite yet into power, but slowly getting there. They also are making up a large part of the workforce, but they're experiencing more of the joblessness than the Pluto and Libras are. And again, you know, they have that mentality. This is a survivor mentality. And in fact, as I said before about media influence, you know, how media shows us the mentality of generations. This is the generation that brought us reality TV. This is a generation that, again, while they are home watching these shows, you know, as they're growing up, doomsday preppers, reality TV, Survivor. I mean, these are all, you know, Pluto. This is clearly Pluto Scorpio psychology. They have, you know, been exposed at very early age to not only, as I said, September 11th, war, economic meltdown, the Occupy movement, Katrina, earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, Banda Aceh, you know, conspiracy theories. From a very young age, that has kind of been the picture of this generation. Well, and another interesting thing that I said about Zuckerberg, you know, making money off your friends, this is the generation, Pluto Libra, as I said, is stretching the boundaries of relating, and they really are. They have explored with the least amount of guilt all different forms of relating. I've seen it with that generation. Pluto Scorpio's taking that to an art form. They're the ones that brought us friends with benefits. Although I'm sure there were some of the Pluto Libras that had that too. But interestingly, in 2009, there was a movie that came out called Friends with Benefits, and sure enough, the entire cast was Pluto Scorpios. They were the 20-something cast. So they were all Pluto Scorpios. So there's something about that. So again, the equality and the sharing that Pluto Libra brings in, Pluto Scorpio's doing it too. And they're doing it in, you know, in the sex death way, right? But I think also at the same time, they're going to continue with that. And I honestly believe that this Pluto Scorpio generation is the pivotal generation because they come in with a do or die mentality. And that is part of their karmic history. They come in with that. No bottom line, it's do or die. And choices that they made in past lives were do or die. And they have the weight of that within their own souls. It's an interesting point that they've pointed out that demographically, that 40% of this generation still lives at home. They call them the failure to launch generation. They call them, again, a lot of this is because of the economic crisis that they've been forced to live at home. But they also say they're commitment phobic. They say that this generation is afraid to make serious choices. And again, my comment on that is in the past lives, many of the choices they had to make were life and death. So I do believe that there is some delaying of making choices, but I also believe, and you know, they're waiting till they're older to make some of those serious choices, which is commitment in relationship, marriage, even committing to one job. Many of them don't want to do that. That started with the Pluto Libra generation, you know, as far as flipping careers more frequently than any previous generation. The Pluto Scorpios, they say as soon as they smell bullshit, they're out of there. So they change jobs like we change underwear. And that sets up a whole new trend for the future generations. But they specifically, because so many of their choices were life and death in the past, they feel that in their soul. So I think that they're delaying that, but I do believe that this generation is going to be one of the pivotal choice generations for all of us, specifically the choice of how we use our resources. And they are forced into that, like I said, their economic awareness. When you grew up and your parents were wealthy and the economy was la 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 fine, you didn't have to look at the realities as much as this generation has had to look at them. And that forms their opinion as well as the way they use resources. So I really feel that this is going to be a choice generation, ultimate choice of how we use our resources, of how we economize or don't economize. And I do think with Pluto's transformational energy heightened in Scorpio, that this generation is going to take a lot of the ideas of the previous generations, you know, transform them into working models simply because they're going to have to do it. This generation's been described echoing back to Pluto, echo the sextile back to Pluto Virgo, which many of them were raised by, although not all of them, but the Pluto Virgo generation, parenting, beginning to parent some of the Pluto Scorpios means some of their values comes off on this generation. And as I said, there's that sextile. They say that this generation is highly suspicious. That, and some of that comes from Pluto Virgo. You know, Pluto Virgo's got that critical cynicism that they brought in with them. I talked about that before. As we know, Virgo is a critical archetype, or criticism is part of that archetype. They have said of this generation that most of them want to live under the radar of establishment. They have, again, this is a demographic study that said this. They have a sense of immediacy as if they are on a faster journey. And again, this totally plays out. Pluto, as I said, Pluto in Scorpio is the most intensified evolutionary pressure signature anybody can have. So not only do we have a generation living that within their psychologies, but all of us alive have experienced that as a transit. So, you know, that also means that we all have experienced an increased evolutionary pressure. But it adds in this generation to that do or die mentality. Here's an interesting thing, and this talks a little bit about the Pluto Sages, but you know what, maybe I'll wait till I get to Pluto Sag to talk about that.
There's a comment on the Pluto Scorpio is that a lot of the sexual abuse from past decades came out as you had Pluto going through Scorpio.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that was something that was initiated beginning with the, like I said, the Pluto Cancer generation and Pluto Leo bringing that out a lot, because that's when actually child rights, children didn't have rights until we got into, Pluto Cancer brought that issue up until we got into Pluto Leo was the first child right legislation. So we again, look at the square of the fruition of that. What does that mean? You know, the awareness of child abuse, sexual abuse in the home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, demographic studies. One thing I want to point out, as I had mentioned before, Pluto Libra associating with Greece and Rome. So if Pluto in Libra just archetypally associates with that kind of past life experience, Pluto Scorpio is definitely Egypt and India. So think of Egypt as the deep mysteries of that. You know, it actually plays out in the astrological ages as the Pluto Taurus. Taurus Scorpio axis, which I won't get into, but Pluto Scorpio generation is highly aligned with Egypt and magical practices from that time, as well as the kind of eternal life death thing. You know, one of the first Book of the Dead came from Egypt, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There's also the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And India is also aligned archetypally with this. So again, we have that kind of deep mystery penetrating kind of psychology. One thing that's been pointed out with this, you know, war and war for this generation, the war on terror specifically is a big part of, again, impact this generation as they're just starting to come of age, and their social consciousness and just starting to come of age, because previously for most generations, again, I'm speaking only in the U.S., war was a governmental act, but now all of a sudden, you know, you can get blown up at the train station, or, you know, blown up at the Boston Marathon, or wherever you are, and so this becomes something that gives a sense of it, they say, that gives a sense of immediacy to this generation. They kind of want it now, because there is an idea that, you know, when acts that are random and unpredictable can end your life, you know, why not make the most of today? So that's also something that's very intrinsic within this generation. I saw one thing in a demographic study of how they are in the workplace, which is funny, and it says that they tend to take challenges like a heat-seeking missile, and they single-mindedly pursue the person in the organization with the most relevant experience. Again, this is a bottom-line mentality. They can, when they want to, absolutely focus on their target, go for it, take what they need, and move on. That's very much part of this generation's mentality. Now, talking about counseling this generation, one thing I want to point out, because I need to move on to the next generations, some of the shows that were part, like I said, Survivor, Doomsday, I went through some of the shows that were popular with this generation. There weren't murder and dead in the title, never in the history of television as much as this generation. You know, The Dead Zone, Dead Like Me, Dark Angel, Woman's Murder Club. I mean, this is just some of the shows. I find it kind of interesting. Okay, moving on to counseling this generation. One thing I find with this generation, they're very much into direct experience, and this is a setup for the Pluto Sagittarius generation, where the Pluto Sagittarius generation will be the most virtually educated generation ever that we've had. This generation also wants direct information when they want it, where they want it. Again, this is this idea of give it to me now, give it to me straight, give it to me concise. What I find with them is, because of that kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, there is a general sense within their psychology that nowhere is safe. And in fact, when I work with Plutos in the 8th house or Pluto Scorpios, I can literally get them to lay on the mat and just say the phrase, nowhere is safe, and it will pull up all of their past life memories of those kinds of experiences. Again, very intrinsic within this generation. But if we think of the polarity point, Taurus, there is something pushing this generation to find that self-resiliency, to find that self-security, to find that life can be gentle, that life can be simple, because they do come in with a very complicated psychology. So counseling this generation has a lot to do with helping them to slow down, let it be gentle, let it be simple, you know, let them know that, I don't even know how to say this, but even if the world's going to end, it'll be okay. You know, something like that, because this is part of what they've come here to learn, is they need to find that within themselves. They are very jaded. They have a soul weariness to them, which is why they have to really trust you, and they say that about them in the workplace too. They don't care about your position. If they don't like you or trust you as a person, they won't listen to what you say. It's interesting because my nieces and nephews are all Pluto Scorpios, and I found myself as a Pluto Virgo. I was raised by Pluto Cancers, trying to figure out what I needed to model for them. And so I was torn between, you know, do I model the kind of qualities that Pluto Cancer brought, which was, you know, a certain kind of properness or a certain kind of, you know, way to be in society, or give it to them bottom line. And I find this generation, they don't want anything else but bottom line. Like I said, so part of also counseling them is counseling them in recognizing the limits of personal power and how to navigate their own intensity. They need to kind of understand what they're capable of, and not get caught, because again, they can get caught in doomsday mentality, not to get caught in it's the end of the world, but to be empowered into what they can do about it. Okay, I need to move on quickly to Pluto Sag, and I have a kind of interesting bridge story here. I did my own little micro study. I happened to be in Connecticut right after the Newtown shootings, which I have these adorable little children there that were victimized in the Newtown shootings. They were all Pluto Sages, by the way. And I'm from Connecticut, lived in Newtown for many years, and I was up north when that happened, and actually went to Newtown to pay my respects and attend some of the memorials. So I happen to be home, and all my family is there. So it was actually, as you also know, that was you know, the famed December 21st end of the world as we know it, you know, ending of the Mayan calendar stuff. So I was with my family in Connecticut on December 21st in 2012, and we had an end of the world bonfire, which is something that they like to have bonfires in the backyard, and there were distinctly two generations there. There was a group of Pluto Scorps and a group of Pluto Sages. So, you know, here we were in the shadow of this horrible thing that had just happened to Newtown 1 week, 2 weeks earlier. So the discussion, of course, went to that. So I used it as a kind of micro study to see the psychology of these two generations. Of course, I'm the Pluto Virgo in the middle analyzing it. So the Pluto Scorpios, interestingly, were totally doomsday. In fact, several of them had said that they were going out to buy more automatic weapons because they were about to be banned. And I asked them, why do you need those? And they said it's all about survival, that we're all going to hell in a handbasket. No, we're in hell already. The handbasket's gone, and that we need these guns to survive. So that was one side of them. What was interesting is one kid, one Pluto Scorpio, was talking to me, and he said, you know what I blame it on? Because obviously we're talking about violence in school. He said, do you know what I blame it on? He said, I was raised with violent video games. All I did was watch violent TV. All I did was play with weapons, you know, even virtual weapons since I was young. And he, interestingly enough, he brought up very much an interesting thing that I've noticed in the Pluto Scorpio generation, that they feel overexposed. They feel there's a sense of vulnerability, like I said, of having seen too much too soon, too young. And he was actually angry about that. That this young kid was standing there telling me this. He was angry about that. Now, on the other hand, there was a bunch of Pluto Sages there, and here's no lie. The Pluto Sages were preparing, several of them, just graduating high school that year, preparing to leave to join the Peace Corps, or the domestic version of that. I think it's called AmeriCorps. So while the Pluto Scorpios were all talking about we're in hell in a handbasket, literally the Pluto Sages were standing there saying, no, we're going off to do something about it. We're going to change the world. This is a much more optimistic generation. And interestingly enough, the demographic studies point out that what they call the pluralists now, the pluralists are the Pluto Sages. Gen Z has now really kind of clearly become pluralists. And this generation, all of the demographic studies point so much optimism, have pinned so much optimism on this poor generation. So we're going to have to see if they really play that out or not. But actually, Forbes has a study that called this generation Rebels with a Cause. They say that despite the frightening times they faced, only 6% of the pluralists are fearful about their future. That's such a marked contrast from the Pluto Scorpios. The Pluto Sages have come in with this kind of karmic buoyancy. They don't have the karmic history the Pluto Sages had. Again, I'm speaking in general because, it's different on the individual level. But they say, at a much younger age, already offering solutions, solving problems. They believe in their own inherent wisdom. They're much more confident about the knowledge that they have within them, which is a classic signature of Pluto and Sagittarius. They are synthesizers. Again, a classic Sagittarian keyword, where again, picking up from Pluto Libra, picking up from Pluto Scorpio about the generational thing that they've grown up now with many generations in the workplace, more generations within their schools because the generations are closer, as well as gender bending. That they say that this generation is more likely to mix and match various points of views, which we already see in Pluto Scorpio. There's like gun-toting vegans, right? and religious fundamentalist tarot readers. Like, expect that from now on, because these generations don't have those traditional roles anymore. They've pretty much done away with them, starting with Pluto and Libra and accelerating through each generation. They are going to defy and continue to defy these traditional forms of categorization. They do say about this generation that they are the least likely to believe in the American dream. Again, some of them are influenced by the Pluto Virgos, some of them raised already, parented by Gen Ys, by some of the Pluto Libras. So they're kind of taking that and realizing that they have to make their own dreams a reality, and many of them have come in with the kind of buoyancy and optimism that they need to make that happen. An interesting marketing study, which had a lot of Pluto Sag keywords in it, said that marketing to this generation is different than other generations, that brands have to be more transparent, more authentic, and more open to negotiation than ever before. The idea of transparency and authenticity is a core theme for this generation. That is part of what the meaning of Sagittarius is. So many of them have come in with the desire to actualize, even deeper than the Pluto Leos, even deeper than the generations before, their authentic selves. So just like the Pluto Scorpios have that bottom line, no bullshit, this generation is a truth-seeking generation. They just tend to do it a little more optimistically than the Pluto Scorpios. This generation, of course, again, starting with Pluto Libra, they say they value speed more than accuracy. This is picking up from the Pluto Libra's sextile. This is all because of the technology. And, it just happened to me this afternoon. I picked up my phone and my whole email program changed, like from the last time that I looked at it to now. It doesn't necessarily look any better to me. It simply looks different. And, the change for change's sake is a little bit of part of the problem of some of the, that we've been experiencing, especially for us older generations that can't keep up with, these younger generations, and how quickly they're changing things, how hyperlinked they are. They do say that this generation, as I said before, will be the first generation with the most access to virtual learning, which may actually transform. Again, think of the archetype of Pluto and think of the archetype of Sagittarius, may transform all of our educational institutions. Higher learning, right? That's a key word of Sagittarius. So we see that already happening with this generation. They say that this generation specifically is going to be the most entrepreneurial generation. So they picked that up from the Pluto Libras, Pluto Scorpios. Moving on, they say that this generation is even more ambitious than the ones prior to them and will be the most entrepreneurial generation we've ever seen. They have resources that even Gen Y didn't have. For example, there's now free courses on websites that Gen Y never had at their availability, where they can just completely self-educate themselves, and in some cases for free. There's more corporations and social institutions reaching out, this is very interesting, to this generation in high school than they ever have in any other generation. There's an organization called the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, which actually has a program in high school now, specifically those in low-income communities, where they offer scholarships for them to develop entrepreneurial business ideas. There's another new, these are new programs, only been running for 3 years. The Teal Fellowship is a program that awards $100,000 to 20 entrepreneurs, young, this is in high schools, who are willing to bypass college to focus on business. So they're already, again, as I said, corporations largely drive demographic studies, and largely because their survival depends on it. They need to understand the upcoming generations because they know that that's going to be their workforce. They need to know what motivates them, and they need to know how to employ them. So they're already responding to this generation in high school and bringing out these kind of entrepreneurial, learn it, rely on your own wisdom, bring that out in the world, which is exactly Pluto Sag. Columbia University has an entrepreneurial program now. I mean, the list goes on. Even Microsoft is offering high school internships now to come in and learn some of the basics of how to create games for Xbox, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all targeted to this generation. This generation's been called more worldly. Their parents say, I think they said something like 70% of mothers of this generation say that they were raised to care and that they know more about global issues than any other generation before them, that it definitely influences them. One thing, the bit that I've seen of this generation, I know when I first started to see them born as babies and held them and, cuddled them and saw them playing, in my mind, the first thing that I thought of this generation was, wow, the lights are on and everybody's home. There's something about their consciousness that is so present, and they bring in a lot of wisdom with them. Again, I'm not getting onto the bandwagon. Again, so many demographic studies have put so much optimism on this generation. But they do have an energy of being wise beyond their years. One thing I do want to point out quickly, and because I need to move on, just so I can cover Pluto Capricorn, is this generation's changing of language, which is an interesting point of the Sag-Gemini axis. This is a generation that they won't have not known how to online publish. This is the first true I generation, digital generation. They call them the digital natives. I mean, they don't know a world before that. So freedom of information is a huge thing for them, and we're going to see that more and more. Online publishing, it's not even a question for them. So the idea of getting your ideas out to a global audience, that's native for them. They don't know any other way prior to that. But that also means they're changing the language systems. And as we've seen, starting with the Pluto, Libras, and Scorpios, they stopped teaching cursive writing in school. I found that interesting. Because the text generation, they only know how to type, and they type in shorthand. This generation, think about when you, again, this is a totally digital generation. Think about when you type in the Google bar and you kind of mistype it, but it already guesses what you're thinking. That's what this generation has grown up with. Intuitive. They will expect technology, if not further develop technology, to intuitively deliver to you the knowledge you want. That's Pluto and Sag, right? I mean, that's transformational. It'll be transformational to the way we communicate, to the way we disseminate knowledge. It'll be a more holistic kind of learning. And and specifically even more intuitive, like expecting somebody to know what you need. Okay, so Pluto and Capricorn. Now, this is a really interesting thing. If I can go back to one of my previous slides. This generation, you notice the demographers ran out of alphabet. But interestingly enough, it's so archetypally perfect because, again, in evolutionary astrology, we say that when Pluto is in a cardinal sign or house, it's actually initiating a brand new stage of evolution. So interestingly enough, at the opposition to Cancer, again, if you think of the generations alive on the planet right now, there's more of them than previous generations. So starting at Pluto Cancer, we are now on the other side of that, Pluto Capricorn. And that new generation is called Generation Alpha. That's one of the proposed names for them. It still isn't tied down. There's a few names being jumped around, but they are saying that most of them are calling them Generation Alpha, which is, again, we go back to the beginning. Again, the archetypal perfection of this is in the Cancer Capricorn archetype. Again, in evolutionary astrology, we describe evolution happens specifically in those two archetypes by one step forward, two steps back. So it's a retrograde way of evolution. It's a retrograde way of advancements that happens naturally within the Cancer Capricorn archetype. So the key word that I've given this generation is changing the future from the past, or the theme that I've given this generation is changing the future from the past. It's actually said in some demographic studies, and again, they're so young now that we don't really see them, they're just little ones. But people are already picking up on their energy. I mean, not only, did we have the economic collapse the second these babies started being born, which to me, I have to tell you, the Pluto Caps that I've been around, I do believe many of them are reincarnated. The ones that are reincarnating immediately are from the Pluto Cancer generation. So several of them, or many of them, have already brought in with them, guess what? The echo of the memory of the Great Depression. So when they started getting born, look at what happened. We had the echo of the Great Depression. Outside of that, because of all of the gender bending that started in Pluto Cancer, really took form in Pluto Libra, this generation, I believe, is the flip of what Pluto Cancer was. As I said, the Pluto Cancer generation, karmically, they were gender switching in their current life. They were, in other words, if they'd been a woman for 10 lives, they were getting used to what it felt like to be out in the world and be a man, and in their future incarnations they would incarnate in the opposite generation. I believe that many people being born in this Pluto Capricorn generation are the opposite. They will find themselves, 10 lifetimes as a woman in a male body. And in this generation, starting with Pluto Scorpio, and in fact there were shows on TV more than there ever had been about transgender and what it meant to feel like one gender internally and be in another gender body externally. I think that's a defining thing of this generation, and we're going to see more of that. I think, I have some predictions for this generation. Like I was saying, some of the names being tossed around for them, it looks like they will decide on Generation Alpha, but one of the other names being tossed around, they're calling them the neoconservatives. So again, think of retrograde. I think that this generation will necessarily need to take a couple steps back into the past and dig back down into what did Pluto Cancer mean, what did Pluto Libra mean, to move us forward. So there may be some demographers have already said things about this generation that they will be more interested in their ancestral roots than any other generation, that they will, rather than race to the future, they're going to look more back to the roots. Now that's demographers already kind of intuitively picking up on what this generation is about. And that is exactly growth in the cardinal archetype of Cancer Capricorn. So I think this generation, they've got a lot on their plate for us as they start to not only be born but come of age and then come into power. They may not be as future-oriented as much as they'll be retrograde and pushing into the future. They definitely are going to be more economically savvy because of what they've grown up with from the previous generations. Like Gen Y, who spent more time in recession than any other generation, they're parented by them. So they are already coming in with that. They also, another thing that they're already projecting because of population, we talk about now about funding the boomers. This generation, as far as aging population is concerned, is going to be the largest challenged generation of how to fund healthcare and how to fund the rising cost of aging, simply by demographic numbers, which is an interesting thing, I think, archetypally, because Capricorn is often associated with old age. It's the winter of life. So I think from an early age, this generation is going to be confronted with that. Just like we are seeing an echo of that with the Pluto Leo generation, Pluto Virgos now coming into aging. Yeah, so they're going to have to, the neoconservative label may apply to them certainly economically. Like I said, I think that the currency is going to be virtual. I think that we may actually move to global economy by the time this generation comes of age and into power. There may not even be national currencies anymore. So they are going to, as the Pluto Sag has brought that global view, this generation is going to have to look at economy on a much more global scale than any other generation. They're going to have to be looking at the expenses. Hopefully the Pluto Scorpio generation will have already brought into reality a wiser use of our resources, because this generation, I believe, is the one that's really going to implement, just like we're seeing now. Again, yes, they're being born, but we're living during Pluto Capricorn transit, and what have we seen since then? The shaking of our social foundations, the shaking of, you know, what makes us secure as a society. We believe that we're going to see the fall of many institutions, things that have become the foundation of society. So think of what that means when this generation is coming of age and coming into power. They're going to be instituting social and institutional things we can't even imagine right now, because we're still in the decay phase. You know, we're in the phase of weeding out. We're in a pruning phase of watching things get blown up and then trying to figure out what's going to take place with them. The other thing that's interesting, like I said, about the gender issue, so I do think, you know, by the time this generation comes of age and comes into power, there's a couple things I've thought of these archetypes. Pluto has a lot to do with genetics and DNA, and Capricorn has a lot to do with ancestry and our roots. You know, there may be a lot more genetic engineering of humans at that time. Because again, think of this, as they start coming of age and coming into power, Pluto's going to be in Aquarius then. Think of the kinds of technologies available to that generation. They have actually said in some demographic studies that this generation will already have electronic implants that will control devices. Like they'll touch their right ear to turn on the mobile phone or touch their left ear to turn it off. I mean, think of that, again, as it relates to this generation coming at what they've inherited from Libra to Scorpio to Sagittarius, and by the time they are growing up and, you know, coming out in the world, Pluto will have moved into Aquarius. So there's that combination of that. The Institute of Marriage, of course, I think is also huge for this generation. They will take something that Pluto Libra picked up from Pluto Cancer, and here's one of my predictions about that, is that they're going to look at relationships more as a business arrangement. It's actually is going to be more like, again, think of them picking up from the Pluto Scorpios, right? And, you know, kind of, you know, what can I get from you, and negotiating that. I think they're actually going to have, like, you know, what we call prenups now, I think is going to be normal. Like they may even just have lease arrangements for marriage, which is something like, we'll make a 10-year commitment and we'll sign here, and this is whose assets are what, and so on and so on and so forth. Again, this generation is going to be more economically savvy than any of the previous generations that we are now all forced to look at, but this generation will have grown up with that. Genetic health care, I think, is huge for this generation. You know, again, thinking of the combination of the Pluto and the Capricorn archetypes, and actually thinking of that, they may actually engineer qualities for babies. I mean, it may come that far by that kind of, you know, DNA manipulation. It's entirely possible that that not only works in our favor, but, you know, could also not work in our favor so well. I'm sure you can imagine some of the different things. Another thing I want to point out that I know about this generation, not that I've worked with them in regression, but when I've worked with Pluto and 10th house people, which carry a similar karma, it's part of the soldier archetype and duty to one's country, which leads me to wonder if by the time this generation isn't coming up, I don't hope that this is true, but that there might be another major world war, especially if many of them are coming in with that soldier kind of mentality. Let's hope it doesn't have to replay, like possibly, you know, the Pluto Scorpios came in with devastation consciousness, and yes, while we've seen a lot of Armageddon mentality, we haven't absolutely actually seen Armageddon. Perhaps that might be the case with this generation too, that they'll bring in those memories, again, if some of them are those Pluto Cancers, bringing in the memories of the world wars, but not having to replay it. Let's hope that's the case. I think that I guess I would just take some questions or comments or anything before we close.
Well, we have some various odds and ends of comments. I like one where economically savvy. I think I'd call it cynical.
Okay, yes, thank you. No, you know, that's such a Capricorn word, absolutely. But their economy is not going to be our economy. This is one thing that, again, think of Scorpio and recycling. They've actually talked about our economy moving from a linear model of which it is now, which is acquire more and build upon the last. They are saying that, and this is my overlay, the Pluto Libras and the Pluto Scorpios are going to bring us a circular economy, which is more trade, more barter, less waste, and again, the way that currency, the value of currency, rather than having it in a linear kind of standard, that it's a circular model. So the way that we see economy now is not going to be the way that the Pluto Caps see it. Or it's not going to be their experience at all. Again, Pat's prediction. Go ahead.
What will they bring to areas of day-to-day work duty that's part of the Capricorn archetype?
Wow, that's a, I guess we could speculate on that. Again, they may go back, it's interesting to see how far they're going to retrograde back. I do believe, like I said, they're going to reinstitute some values that the Pluto, Libras, and Scorpios and Sagittarius thought were long gone. They may reach into what me as a Pluto Virgo would call our grandparents' generation, or the Pluto Cancer generation. So there may be some of that. I mean, I don't know. I can't see a complete retrograde of going to that kind of managerial structure of the ultimate authority. I think that the way that this generation is going to play it out is that even more than the Scorps and the Sages, they're going to be their own authority. They're going to be their own boss, and that's going to be intrinsic within the workplace somehow. I don't know how that looks. The model is actually kind of shifting that way anyway, if we think about it. When we think about virtual work and people kind of more independent in the workplace. So yeah, I kind of see that.
Well, considering some of the Earth changes and things, I can see a return to some of that on sacrificing for the greater good from a practical Capricorn level.
Yeah.
Not necessarily from the same kind of emotional that you get from the Cancer that could be.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, the idea, this is one thing I forgot to mention, so thank you for that thought. What I believe is the ideals of Pluto Libra is going to be practically implicated by Pluto and Capricorn. I think that much of the vision, and even some of the vision of Pluto Sag, Pluto Capricorn's going to be like, bang, get it done.
There is another question here on what do you find as a kind of a timing formula for when natal Pluto, somebody with a natal Pluto in a sign begins to affect the larger society?
Well, I have to look at that because Pluto in a sign can't mark that just because of that elliptical orbit. Mm-hmm. So I tend to look at that as what are the hallmarks of coming of age in our social system as it is now. So gaining social awareness is high school. So that's a first initiatory phase for each generation. And then graduating college or going into the workforce is another kind of initiatory age. So that's what, your 20s, right? What are you, 18, 19, 20, graduating from college? And then coming into management or coming into power within a workplace. So again, like I said, the generations are doing that at younger ages, but I would say 20s to 30s, and coming into power, meaning influence on the collective in a way like I mentioned, Obama being the first leader in our country of the Pluto Virgo generation. In their 40s to 50s is the age of fruition, of coming into power.
Yeah, that makes sense as a timing. Yeah. There is a comment on sacrificing for greater is probably postponed to Pluto and Aquarius, not Capricorn. I think the Capricorn would do so from a very practical standpoint. The Aquarius, I don't know. Maybe the Aquarius might do it from more of a, no, this is how it ought to be? I don't know. What would you think, Patricia?
Well, there's different sides to Aquarius. Remember, Aquarius has a dual, has a dual rulership that's very strongly represented in that sign. It's Saturn and Uranus. So on one level, there is that kind of collective idealism and sacrifice for humanity. And on the other level, there's Saturn in there too, right? Now, I do think that Pluto and Capricorn will be a highly ambitious generation. I do. The thing is, again, and I'm not really predicting this, but I'm just going to use it as an example from the Pluto Cancer generation. If there is another world war, just like the Pluto Cancer was, they were forced to put their own needs aside. So, I mean, yes, we can see that tendency easier with Pluto Cancer than we can with Pluto Capricorn, because we think of Capricorn as, you know, the apex of one's personal power, of authority, etc. I mean, I can see a lot of dark side of this too that I'm not getting into, but if you, again, just think of right now the kinds of things that we've seen with Pluto and Capricorn, and you know, the overreaching of corporate power, the dehumanization of people, right? I mean, an unfortunate part of this archetype is repression of emotion. And how dangerous are people when they are out of touch with their emotion? That's what they talk about, sociopathic, the sociopathy of our corporate mentality today. That's largely a Pluto Capricorn mentality. I mean, it's those combined archetypes, Scorpio and Capricorn, right, are corporations. And we're seeing them now with Pluto and Capricorn. We're seeing them come into the height of their sociopathy. So, you know, I don't know how the Pluto Capricorn generation's going to play it. Maybe there'll be like a whole bunch of sociopaths born. I don't know. Let's hope not, you know.
Well, the only other hope is that you do have that seriously practical side that may decide that that doesn't really work, that shadow doesn't work, so they try something different. Let's hope so.
Yeah, well, there isn't any profit in it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I think we need to wrap up for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.